so I'll close as it says here. So thank you to folks that are tuning in. We decided to have an important discussion about voting rights that's particularly timely. On a national level, we just saw the Senate fail to pass important voting rights legislation due to the endurance of the filibuster, since Democrats have yet eliminated that. And I believe it was likely the 51-50 vote, with Joe Manchin finally agreeing to sign on, which stalemate at the federal level on an important issue of our time of protecting our democracy, but bringing it down to Massachusetts, we can actually do stuff. 1 year ago, around this time, the legislature had expanded voting rights amidst the COVID-19 pandemic for the fall elections last year, and they were popular, they were successful, and they're now only moving forward on a patchwork basis. So to discuss what all this means here in Massachusetts, what we can be doing, I invited my friend Patrick Roath, who's a voting rights advocate, an attorney, and a former board chair for Common Cause. Patrick, welcome.
Great, thanks for having me, Jonathan. Great to be here again. It's good.
And so, since you've been actively following the stuff, do you want to just give people a quick, but a little bit better summary than I did about the status of voting rights on the federal level?
Sure.
The debate around kind of H1, S1, and kind of another legislation.
Great, good place to start given what just happened, unfortunately. And I'll say the failure of the For the People Act to pass the Senate is not just because of the filibuster, it's because of 50 Republican senators that refuse to take action to improve our democracy, or in fact trying to erode it every step of the way, as we see in other states and in the Congress, right? So a huge priority for progressives, for Democrats, for Americans is strengthening our democracy right now, making it so that more and more people can participate, and also hardening it against the kinds of things that we saw start to happen in the last few months and in the last presidential election, where there are concentrated groups of people who are trying to subvert the outcomes of free and democratic election, and also make it harder for particular groups that they don't want to vote to show up at the ballot. And so, yeah, the Democrats' signature voting rights package has attracted the support of the full Democratic caucus, is broadly popular among the American people. I think at levels of like the 60 to 70% level. It does quite a few things, but it would sort of magnify some of the things that we've seen work best in other states to a national level. So things like early voting, things like improved access to mail-in voting, things like same-day registration. And instead of having some states go off in other directions where it makes it harder for certain groups to vote, it would provide a national standard where everybody could participate at a fair level. So, the fight there is not done, right? There's a ton more to be done at the federal level, like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which has to be our next priority. I hope we can return to some of the provisions in the For the People Act, but we have to fix the Voting Rights Act, and that's up next.
So for people who aren't familiar or vaguely term, what's in that bill as well?
So the Voting Rights Act has been landmark legislation since the middle of the 20th century, right? What it did is put some jurisdictions with a history of making it harder for non-white people basically to vote, and most predominantly in the South, but all over the country. It put them under a little bit more pressure to justify any changes under their voting structure. The Department of Justice had to approve those changes to make sure that they weren't motivated by animus toward those groups of voters. The Supreme Court struck down the key part of that law in the Shelby County decision in 2013. Ever since then, we've been trying to get it back. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is about reinstating that strong protection so that the federal government can police jurisdictions and stop things like we're seeing in Georgia, stop things like we're seeing in Texas, where they're making it harder for mostly Black voters to vote.
The one thing, going back to a point that you just made that's particularly striking, so voting, even though there were always partisan divides in recent history in voting rights, it really is a striking contrast from, let's say, 15, 16 years ago, with the fact that Republicans fully opposed to any expansion of voting rights. Never, at least, not since, let's say, the contemporary political era, the Republican Party hasn't really been much of a fan of expanding voting rights, but on extending kind of pre-clearance and stuff. I believe that was back in, was it 2004, 2005, 2006, maybe some period in the mid 2000s when they had the last extension of that. And it was broadly bipartisan still then. I think it didn't get every Republican vote, but it still had Republican support. but that really, especially since Obama's election in 2008, the Republican Party has shifted to a very hardline opposition on the federal level to any expansion of voting rights, with maybe a few exceptions in each case. Like I know that I think the Senator Lisa Murkowski supports the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, there was a bipartisan consensus that the Voting Rights Act that passed in the 60s that made it so that, you know, people could actually vote in large parts of the South where Black people just weren't able to vote for generations. There was bipartisan consensus for that leading into the 21st century, and that has eroded as we've seen the modern Republican Party change into metastasize into what it is. And there's pockets of support in that party for fixing the Voting Rights Act, and I think that could be. I think there's hope there. You know, I think it could clear 60, but we'll see. That it's going to be a lot of work in Washington to get that passed.
But yeah, it's definitely something. It's a rather damning reflection of the Republican Party, where people like Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham say that it's a kind of shameless power grab for Democrats to believe in things like making it easier for people to vote. Which I like to say that if you believe that if you have a good case to be making for yourself as a candidate, you should see no problem with more people voting.
Yep.
Rather than
a power grab is when the president of the United States calls an elections official in Georgia and says that he needs to figure out a way to subvert the results of a democratic election. I mean, that there was true attempts at election subversion, and that's what we need to be on the lookout for.
Exactly, or even kind of the efforts that we're seeing in states right now to make it easier to just decertify election results on very weak grounds, which is like the definition of a shameless power grab, directly going against the will of the voters. But to bring things here to kind of on a Massachusetts level, as we often like to say, we're seeing stalemate or slow progress on the federal level. We in the states, as Louis Brandeis used to say, like the laboratories of democracy, have the opportunity to actually pass things without waiting for the federal government. And Massachusetts has, and what's striking with Massachusetts on voting rights is we're not really a leader on voting rights nationally. We tend to lag. I've often laughed that when we see certain other states roll back their early voting periods or roll back same-day registration, and it's still more progressive than
us. Yeah.
Right. It's a rather embarrassing state of affairs. But if you can, for people, can you orient people a little bit? What did the legislature pass last year in response to COVID? People experienced this, but can you give us some of the highlights, as well as the Votes Act, which is the main push to expand that, to make that permanent and expand that this session, about how that takes that and goes further.
Yeah, great. So it was just about a year ago, and you know the legislature passed a really meaningful reform in Massachusetts, which is really exciting. And you know, last year was such a crazy and sad year for so many people here, and for so many reasons, most because of the pandemic. But it was actually like a really historic year for voting in Massachusetts, because we had not historically had those voting options. We had not had no excuse mail-in voting. We had not had those drop boxes that everybody could use. You didn't get that application in the mail to cast a mail-in vote if you wanted to do that. And we had more support for things like early voting to spread out that period of voting around the main elections last year. And you know, that was really exciting, and it worked well, right? We had record turnout in the primary. We had record turnout in the general election. It's not just because we passed that bill last year, but that was a big piece of it. That enabled people to vote safely and at levels that they had not, you know, voted in the past in the middle of a pandemic. So, and that comes from a history. Massachusetts does not lead on these issues historically, right? Unfortunately, we've got great elections and we all love to participate in them, but you know, there's 21 other states that have passed same-day registration, and we're not one of them, and DC, right? So we're not exactly leading the country on that. So,
and what's same-day registration?
What's that?
What's same-day registration?
Same-day registration is just like it sounds, right? So if you show up that day of the election or in the days preceding the election when early vote's happening, you can register there on the spot as long as you're, you know, a legal resident of the district you're voting in. And importantly, not only can you register, but you can also fix your registration. So all those people who get turned away on election day because they move down the street and have to cast a provisional ballot, and maybe, you know, don't want to do that or don't want to do the work to clear it afterwards, they'll be able to register, which is huge. And it just, it streamlines things. It makes it easier over time for election administrators, even though it requires a lot more work on election day. And it brings more people into the process. It's the one reform that's been shown to really open up our elections to historically overlooked communities and poorer communities where people don't vote at the same level for whatever reason as in higher income communities. But you're getting ahead of me because that's where we got to go, right? But where we are now, where we are now is, as you said, Jonathan, so it all expired at the end of last year. All that good stuff that we passed last year expired because it was temporary COVID stuff. They've kicked it out, and now we've got it through June 30th. And there's been a coalition of people working really hard, including Common Cause, and of course, people at Progressive Mass and the ACLU, trying to lock in those gains from last year and then also push forward in advance. So the main vehicle, I'll talk a little bit about the Votes Act, which I think is the main vehicle for making those changes and for getting us to where we need to go next. So the Votes Act, I mean, the first thing it does is just make everything from last year permanent, right? So we'd have those options. We'd have the ability to cast mail-in voting, mail-in ballots, more early voting and more drop boxes, and provide communities and voters with that better set of options. And number two is what we're talking about, same-day registration, right? Is actually bringing Massachusetts up to the level of all those other states and helping us lead on some of these issues when we see states doing crazy things and the federal government failing to respond, as it did this evening. And that, look, it's something we've been working on for a long time, right? I mean, I'm sure you have, a lot of people have been asking for same-day registration to happen. And we have a real shot this year to get it done as part of this bigger elections reform push. And then a few other things that are in the sort of grab bag of the Votes Act, things like fixing automatic voter registration, which we worked super hard to get passed in 2018.
And so what needs to be fixed there?
Yeah, so automatic voter registration is just what it sounds like, right? I mean, the state already has all of your information. And if you are a citizen, if you're 18 years of age or older, you're entitled to vote. And it just would automatically register you to vote unless you decided not to do that, because you of course have the right not to be registered if you wouldn't want to be. But rather than enact the law that was passed in that sort of opt-out way that I just described, and it's been implemented in an opt-in manner. So voters have to affirmatively take a step to allow the state to register them. And that, and because of that, and because of like wonky bureaucratic behind the scenes stuff, it has not led to the increased number of registered voters that we were hoping to see, and that other states have seen when they've implemented automatic voter registration. So it's a way of accessing a huge group of people in Massachusetts right now who can vote, who I bet you want to vote, but who haven't been because they're not part of this registration system that dates back to the early 1900s.
And we've seen that with other states that have done this, whether they've done it on an opt-in or an opt-out basis. I forget, like, you may remember which I remember, did Colorado do it on an opt-in basis? Oregon was opt-out. I remember that.
Yeah, Oregon always comes to mind as like
that's kind of like the gold standard.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Arizona or Colorado did it, but it didn't have the same effect because that's the comparison, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it might have been in Colorado because for the simple reason, basic human psychology, if you want people to do something, if you make it an opt-out system, you will have better intake. If you have an opt-in system, you're requiring additional work for people to make something happen. Not saying that people are lazy, people just have many things on their mind, and if they have the opportunity to be like, they start debating about that, just registering people, they're on the rolls. If they want to take themselves off later, they can take themselves off later. But it makes the default inclusion on the voter rolls to make it so that we're not treating registration as a barrier to participating in elections.
Yep. So that's an important piece of it. And then, one or two, there's other things, but one or two other pieces I'll flag is that it improves options for jail-based voting too, right? So in the Commonwealth, as you know, we have lots of individuals who are in correctional facilities who retain the right to vote. And but it's hard. It's hard to vote if you're behind bars in the correctional system right now. There's just not a lot of good options. And so this has some new requirements and some new sort of like information gathering. It introduces those provisions to make it easier for people who can vote but are in correctional facilities.
And I think making jail-based voting is something that's important and goes overlooked because of the implications that it has for people even after they've left. Because Massachusetts isn't in a situation like some other states where people after they've served their time are still banned from voting, which is a horrific thing. But it's under current law in Massachusetts, if you lose your right to vote, shouldn't, but you do, if you're currently incarcerated with a felony conviction. used to not be the case due to a kind of fairly racist ballot effort back in the kind of around the turn of this most recent century. That vote was taken away from people. But what that impact ultimately has is, if you don't have the right to vote while incarcerated, or if you have the right to vote, but it exists only in theory rather than in practice due to the lack of actual implementation, it increases the likelihood that people think they don't have the right to vote after they leave.
Of course, yeah, of course.
Because since they have experienced that loss of vote as something tied to incarceration, might think that they don't have it after they leave, and that can lead to them not participating in the process, even though it has been their right to do so.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of formal education resources for letting people know, right, that they have that right, that they can exercise it, that it comes back to them after they serve their period of incarceration. So, I mean, there's just a lot of work to do in that space, and there's a lot of dedicated activists in Massachusetts.
Yeah, it reminds me in some ways around the same day registration, where eliminating the possibility of confusion around registration is an inherent good. Because something the same day registration, if there's kind of somebody's kind of in any way confused, if you live there, you can re-register there, you can vote there, rather than have there's a typographical error in your data. If you missed the deadline because it's not like the deadline is advertised to everybody pushing an election. It's also something that's useful for poll workers who don't have to process provisional ballots, if they can just register people at the polls. It just makes for a smoother experience.
Yep, that's right. And it deters fewer people who are just, if you don't speak English as a native language, for example. I mean, there's just a lot of complexities and bureaucracy to the system, maintaining all of these old rules. And
so what are the biggest obstacles that that bill faces in the legislature to make those reforms permanent?
Great. Well, none.
Build on them as well.
There shouldn't be any. We've got a Democratic supermajority. There are a majority of the legislators in each of the two chambers have become co-sponsors of the legislation, which would suggest to you, under normal circumstances, that it would pass easily. So I think our work here is done. But yeah, but so it hasn't happened yet. As you know, there's been a lot of legislative process, and look, it's a lot of big changes for sure, and so it deserves a hearing. It deserves thought, and it's good that our elected representatives are thinking about it carefully. But as sort of the premise of this conversation, June 30th, this thing expires, and we are going to revert to the way that Massachusetts conducted its elections before last June, before the pandemic. And so, and we can get into sort of like the legislative dynamics that exist, but I think that there's a bill of this size that changes things that much. There's just a lot of inertia that we're working up against, and people have legitimate concerns, and there's no reason not to hear those. But it seems like a suite of reforms whose time has come. Everyone on paper is on board, so I think we should just pass the thing.
But the June 30th deadline is especially significant because none of these reforms will apply to the fall elections that happen in cities across the state unless legislative action is taken.
That's right. So, I mean, the Boston preliminary election is like 90 days away now, right? I mean, millions of people will vote, hopefully hundreds of thousands of people will vote.
Yeah.
And there's north of 20 local towns that have elections, starting in July and throughout the fall. That are, currently the folks who are administering the elections in those towns have a lot of uncertainty about what rules will apply, and a lot of those voters aren't sure if they'll have the same options as last year. So it really ought to be remedied soon.
And it's a striking thing to think of in terms of expanding voting rights and voting access, and then saying, sorry guys, won't happen anymore.
Right.
Have a great year.
It doesn't happen much for that reason. People get used to these nice things that it turns out we can do once we have them.
Exactly. And the one thing especially that's when it comes to the nice things that we realize that we can do, that with same day registration, which we were just talking about, that actually existed on a de facto basis last year for a short period, as I remember that you had pointed out, because if you extend early voting far enough, and if you shorten the registration window, so that the registration deadline falls within the early voting period, you effectively have same day registration.
That's right. There was a period of overlap, right? So there are two periods sort of coincided, and the sky did not fall, right? I mean, there was the Secretary of State put out some guidance about how to do this, and communities were taking people in and they were voting just that day, and it worked out just fine, just like it does in our neighbors to the north in New Hampshire.
Yeah, and it's something especially funny, like with the New Hampshire connection, is that Massachusetts folks are known for going to New Hampshire to help with campaigns. And there's a certain irony that we go to help to campaigns where they actually have better voting access in that way than we do. So like we could, if we wanted to go to New Hampshire, help turn people out who need to update their registration on the day, but we can't do that back at home.
Yeah, and New Hampshire, in many ways, and this is like Massachusetts, it has a highly localized way of running its elections. These little towns all over the place that have celebrate their election traditions and have been doing it the same way for hundreds of years, it seems like. And the town clerk knows everybody who shows up that day, but they're able to do this just fine. There's tons of students in New Hampshire too that they have to work around that issue.
Mm-hmm. And then, so thinking of the kind of current status of things with the legislature, I know earlier this month the House did pass something, but they didn't actually follow any process around the Votes Act, but they made some of the things permanent. What was in with the House passed?
Yeah, that's right. So, there's been a hearing. The Votes Act is the main vehicle, but there's lots of really great election bills that have been filed by other legislators and supported by other advocates. And, those should all get a hearing. What happened in the House is that in connection with the budget process, there was an amendment that would do a kind of a very skinny down version of the permanent mail-in voting, right? So it would apply, it would allow no excuse mail-in voting going forward in state elections, not in local elections, not in the presidential primary. It wouldn't do anything about the 10-day cutoff window that we currently have in Massachusetts for registration. And it's just kind of a narrow version of this, which would give us some relief or some extension of what we were able to secure last year, but doesn't really get to the full picture. And it certainly doesn't embrace reforms like same-day registration or jail-based voting and all the things that we think we need. So look, it's a start. It's atypical to change elections through a spending bill, but that's how the House chose to do it. It's laudable that they're moving quickly. They do know the June 30th deadline is looming, right? But we're hoping in the state Senate we'll get more of the hearing. There'll be a more comprehensive look at the things that we could do to improve our elections going forward.
And to your point, and even after June 30th, that 10-day voter registration cutoff goes back to 20.
Under the House proposal. Yeah.
That's right. Well, even under current law, right? If nothing happens, kind of like stroke of midnight and Cinderella, the like kind of
that's right.
Things go back to the way that they were. And it was also striking to me about in that proposal that although it had good reforms for thinking about 2022, since it only defined election in the term of the biennial state elections and biennial state primaries, wouldn't actually affect the elections in the fall.
Right.
Which is where the urgency around this, and there's urgency, is around getting things in place for the fall. And it was striking to me that they would go around kind of process to then of like urgency of timeline to then push something that isn't actually that urgent.
Right, but not implementation. Yeah, no, it's a great point. And we have tons of friends who are involved in elections in the fall, right? And they are, my sense is that they are expecting there to be the options, at least in Boston, but that is not materialized. And we all hope that that's true, and I may very well be, but if that's what gets passed, then they're out of luck.
Yeah, and the timeline is especially short for that because the legislature doesn't tend to do work in August. Right. So you pretty much have the month of July, because you're not going, it would be too chaotic to, when they come back, probably would even be after Labor Day, which will be like about a week before a number of these municipal preliminary elections take place, to say, okay, you can vote early now. You just can't do that.
At least last year we had like a couple months to prepare. And they did a great job with it. And that was abbreviated. It was much shorter than what people are used to here.
Yeah.
But we're talking a really tight window.
Yeah, it'll be very tight this year. I remember I looked last year out of curiosity about when that date was, and it was finally signed by the governor on July 6th. Of last year. So we're rapidly approaching that same amount of notice that we had, that municipalities were given last year and candidates were given. And so there's action that needs to happen.
Around the clock.
And for people who want that to happen, what are things for people for watching that they should be doing to help
Great, great. Well, we had a really successful lobby day a couple months ago, which was great. That was a great opportunity to virtually get in front of people at the State House. There's some, I can provide maybe, we can provide sort of like next to the video, some of the links.
Yeah.
Common Cause Massachusetts has an online petition, which is really great. There's tons of phone banking and letters to the editor that you can do to try and talk to people talk to your representatives. There's also, I don't know if you saw this, there's a great rally this Saturday. We're going to be on the Common in front of the State House at 2 p.m. on Saturday. And a lot of folks will be speaking. I'll be speaking at that. And that'll be a really great opportunity to kind of show strength. And it's really about changing our elections at the federal level and getting that done. But I mean, of course, we got to talk about what we need to do here in Massachusetts too. So there's going to be a ton of opportunities, and there'll be, I know Progressive Mass has been doing some great phone banking and text banking too, so which is great.
And when it comes to voting stuff going on now, just one thing, if probably confusing to some people following this. Have you been following the kind of the debates about re-precincting going on? Re-precincting is itself a term that I feel most people never actually interact with on a day-to-day basis. But it's been in the news lately because of a battle between the state legislature, particularly on the House currently, and the Secretary of State, Bill Galvin, about the order in which re-precincting happens. So what is at stake in that debate? Why the drama around this term that many people have never heard of?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure exactly why there's drama there. I mean, so the underlying drama is that the Census Bureau was governed by the Trump administration for 4 years. And it was not provided with the tools and the resources and the leadership it needed to do its job in a timely manner given a pandemic, right? So the census, what underlies all this is that the census was severely challenged last year in getting its count done. And as a result, the numbers are going to come in late to all the different states. Now, we need those numbers to figure out what the best way to fairly allocate precincts and districts are in Massachusetts. We tend to have a good process here that's not just about partisan gerrymandering. It's about actually providing opportunities for communities to be represented in all sorts of different ways, and that meaning of the word. Now, there's a question of who gets to do it first. Do the local communities get the first crack at it like they traditionally do, or does the state get to do it, which is a little non-traditional, but kind of provides us with an opportunity to set the boundaries right and go from there. I think it's a pretty inside the State House debate in a lot of ways, but to me, we're going to get this information really late. The state legislature is like primed and has been super on top of it. The committee's ready to do its work. I think the thing to do is to let them do their work. And if local communities have to fill in the gaps after that, which is not the way it traditionally works, but should work just fine.
And it's the way that many other states actually already do it. Is
that's right.
Where most states already have the districts drawn and the precincts drawn to reflect the districts.
Yep.
And to some extent, at least I would think that order would almost by design put pressure to reduce the number of split municipalities.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense to me too. Yeah, which is a good thing for people being represented who live in cities.
Exactly. It also helps to make it so that if you build, and in some ways it feels logical to build your legislative districts out of census tracts and census blocks as opposed to out of precincts, because you have better data about the census tracts and census blocks.
Yep.
Whereas I think when it comes to precinct level data, some of that's just kind of projections based on the census data. They don't match, like as I know that they don't in Boston. It's striking to see how the census, to compare them to precincts where they're like somewhat near each other, but the kind of, at least in Boston, which hasn't actually redrawn precincts in a century,
which is a whole other story.
Exactly, which is kind of a mess.
Yeah.
But so what other challenges what other challenges that we'd face in implementation? I know one thing when we were chatting before this that you noted that, let's say the legislature gets its act together and they manage to, before the fall, have something approximating the Votes Act. There's still a funding question for that. So can you talk a little bit about what the debate is there?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's no pretending that asking our local towns and cities to do more in and around election day isn't going to cause more burden and more work. I mean, it absolutely is. We are asking our local election officials to do more. And I think that the thing to do is, if we're doing that, we should be supporting them more too, right? They should have access to more funding. And you know what happened last year? There were heroic efforts in a lot of parts of the Commonwealth to try and make sure that all those applications went out. It was a brand new process, you know, and everything got back. And of course, there were some mistakes. There were things that got messed up along the way because it was a novel thing, and it really put our system under a stress test. So I think, to me, I mean, if we're going to do all these things, the state needs to provide adequate funding for cities and towns on a permanent basis to make sure that communities are able to do this. You can't just pass some unfunded mandate. And you also can't, I mean, it's great to give communities flexibility in how they want to administer their own elections. That's appropriate. But if there's no adequate funding to do these kinds of to do these kinds of reforms, we're going to end up with communities that have fewer affluent people and fewer resources, just providing residents and voters with less access to the ballot. And it's going to lead to, it's going to magnify the disparities that we already see in voter turnout around the state, and it's going to make it harder for people to vote. So I mean, look, the state pays for a lot of things. We shouldn't be overtaxing the state budget, because there's things like education and healthcare we need to absolutely be paying for. But I'm just not convinced that this line item is going to be so huge going forward that we can't adequately fund cities and towns to have better elections.
Yeah, it's likely really just a minuscule thing in terms of the scale of the state budget. That's like beyond, almost like a rounding error in types of total value. And as well as because of the state's greater ability to pay for things, it is less of a burden on the state than it is on municipalities. So to your point, that it's something that a Weston, a Lexington, a Dover, if they want to be able to front the cost for this, it's not going to be that hard.
Yeah, and guess where the high turnout
exactly. Where there's high turnout, but like Holyoke or Lawrence or Springfield, it will be much more difficult to get the money.
That's right. And one thing that the Votes Act does is also to think more about how the state can play more of a role in sending those applications out instead of local towns, right? So we can have that process more centralized in the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office, and the money can flow there, and that can be deployed there. So, which just makes sense. So we're not asking clerks in communities across the state to take that burden on, because they're busy.
And then, so as we try to kind of push this forward in the coming weeks, what are some of the excuses that you hear from legislators about why they don't want to do this, and what are the best ways to push back against them?
You don't hear them that much. They're out there. Well, look, what we've just been talking about, I think, is real. A lot of legislators know the clerks in their communities. They know folks who are administering the elections. And, I think that there is a level of concern about the amount of additional work and the burdens that this would impose on local communities, right? And I guess my answer to that has always been, like, New Hampshire does it, lots of other states do it, and we can just, fund them adequately to get this done. So I think that's part of that response. To the extent there are concerns about reforms such as same-day registration, introducing things like election fraud, or bringing in more people who didn't used to vote here and maybe just moved to the state and are new here, or are students. I think that, first of all, if you're a student and you live here, you still have a right to vote, and we shouldn't be. I'd like to think that sort of like a premise of this whole discussion is that we're trying to improve access to the ballot and not deny more people. And then, as for fraud, that does come up sometimes. People are a little concerned that you can just show up that day and get registered. But look, all the same things that would apply normally if you're registering to vote in Massachusetts apply. You have to swear to your residence. You do have to affirm. And if you lie, or if you try to vote twice, or you vote somewhere you're not supposed to, you can be penalized. Like there's rules on the books for doing that, if you do it intentionally, not like negligently.
The thing that's always just kind of so tongue-in-cheek funny to me is about the idea that it's anybody who's ever volunteered for a campaign knows how hard it is to get for people to actually just vote in the first place. It's always funny for me to think about, like, the idea of people voting multiple times, which just doesn't happen, frankly. But like, it's hard enough to get people to vote once.
Right. No, then just, there's no evidence of it. We've seen no voter fraud. Of course, there's been a decade and a half of Republicans trying to find examples of it. And it's accelerated in the last election, but there's virtually no examples of it.
And it's something I remember even hearing with this past election, where Trump was trying to get then Attorney General Bill Barr to find him evidence of voter fraud. And Bill Barr, who's no progressive or liberal by any means of the imagination found that there was no fraud going on to Trump's
Of course,
dismay.
except for the Republican.
Except for a few Republican cases of fraud.
Yeah.
And like, I know one of the biggest cases recently was just actually a Republican doing an absentee vote, kind of like a vote farming effort.
Yeah.
Which again was coming out of Republicans doing it, but it's not something that ever really exists on a large scale. And the one thing that's also good when it comes to the security that's actually in the Votes Act is about helping to maintain voter rolls with trying to finally get Massachusetts in this one statewide consortium that Massachusetts should already be in for the automatic voter registration bill.
Right, and it's not purging voters, right? We're not using this to try and get people off the road. It's joining an interstate consortium that actually makes it easier to change and update your registration if, like many people do in today's society, move from state to state, right? If you're a student or if you just make a move, this is an interstate consortium that helps that data be more portable and kind of cleans up and modernizes.
Yeah.
And we've had a statutory requirement that Massachusetts join that for some time. It hasn't happened yet. And one thing we want to do is just reaffirm that requirement and put a deadline on it.
And so for some kind of like final kind of reflections, what are some of the key takeaways that you'd want somebody watching to leave this with about what they should be doing, and what is your hope that we'll see in the next few months?
Yeah, well, look, you don't really need to persuade many people these days that voting rights matters, and the way that we structure our elections and conduct them make a huge difference to how we live our lives, to how this country is going to be governed in the future. And it's a scary time out there. If you look at some of the state legislatures and some of the things that are not just being proposed, but being passed and enacted into law that have the opportunity to severely subvert a democratic and free election from happening in parts of the country, and in purple and red parts of the country, right? But here in Massachusetts, we don't have necessarily that sort of like intentional attempts to subvert or suppress free election, thank goodness. But what we do have, I think, is an opportunity to hold this place up as an example, right? And show what a real democracy, a multiracial, equitable, just democracy looks like. And I think we've got the opportunity to model that for the rest of the country. And it's so important now. It's so much more important if the Congress is not going to be able to pass any of this. And we need to prove to the rest of the country that this can be done. Massachusetts can do it. The rest of the country can do it as well. We get all these news reports about what's happening in Texas, what's happening in Georgia. It's super important, but people here in Massachusetts have voting rights too. And they don't have like the maximum amount of voting rights they have. This isn't the utopia for voting. And it could be, right? We could really improve our laws. I think this is an opportunity. The pandemic's given us an opportunity to take advantage of it. And I hope that's what we do.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining. People want to follow kind of your advocacy around this or the issue in general. Where should they go?
Great. Well, Progressive Massachusetts is a great resource, of course. I'm a member, and I'm remembering now. I think I still need to pay my dues for the year. So I'll do that. Well, the organization I used to be a part of, Common Cause Massachusetts, is of course a leader. Our friends at Mass Vote and the ACLU. I'm on Twitter, Patrick Roath too. And I hope that we'd love to see you on the rally on Saturday. And otherwise, there's lots of other good ways to engage.
Awesome, and I'll put in a plug as well that on our scorecard website at Progressive Mass, that's scorecard.progressivemass.com. You can put in your address and you can find out if your legislators are currently co-sponsors of the bill or not. And whether they are or not, they should still hear from you about the importance of passing the Votes Act sooner rather than later.
That's right.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining this evening.
Great. Well, thanks for having me.
And thank you for everybody who's currently or still watching.